Hello and welcome to lecture number 17. This is topic 2.6, labor, culture, and the economy. The first learning objective is to describe the range and variety of specialized roles performed by enslaved people. There was a wide range of roles that enslaved people had on plantations. The first enslaved people in what is now the United States arrived in 1619 in the Chesapeake Bay in the settlement of Jamestown. They ended up becoming servants to Jamestown officials and the preferred planters of the settlement. The types of work they did in all rural areas fall into three main categories: domestic work, agricultural work, and skilled work. Domestic work was usually done by women or young children, helping with cooking, washing, cleaning, and child rearing. These jobs were often around the clock without specific end times. Agricultural work was usually in the tobacco fields in the Upper South, in the rice fields in the Carolinas, or in the sugar plantations in the Caribbean islands. Depending on the type of system used on the plantation, they were either overseen by a slave driver from sunup to sundown, or if they were in the task system, they were given a specific task for the day and would be done with their work once it was accomplished. The skilled workers included carpenters, coopers, potters, tanners, and shoemakers, and they were responsible for furnishing the plantation with necessary goods. People of all ages and genders worked on the plantations. The men initially perceived field work as women's work based on their experiences in their African regions of origin, and women also did weaving as one of their only skilled tasks available to them, in addition to their domestic work. Because slavery also existed in northern and urban areas, enslaved people in those regions worked as artisans, shopkeepers, messengers, and dock workers. There were distinct roles separating domestic and agricultural labor. Agricultural work was based on the plantation's crop. For plantations that grew tobacco, enslaved people planted, harvested, cured the tobacco leaves, dried them, and packaged them for sale. For cotton plantations, they planted, harvested, removed seeds using a gin, and packaged it for export. Domestic workers often had longer days working in the plantation home, taking care of children, or cooking meals, resulting in longer hours than field workers, even though it wasn't as physically taxing. Enslaved people could be relocated to various types of jobs according to the preference of the enslaver, usually providing the necessities of any plantation, including making items like nails, hinges, and locks. Not all enslaved people were bound to individual persons. Some were bound to churches. For example, the Catholic Church profited from the slave trade on the North American continent. The Jesuits in Louisiana held enslaved people and sold 272 to pay off the debts of Georgetown University early in its history. Factories also owned enslaved people, sometimes referred to as industrial slaves, who worked in sawmills, refineries, and mines. Colleges and universities like Brown, Harvard, UVA, and Yale received endowments from slave fortunes. In some cases, such as Harvard's, they owned enslaved people who worked on campus doing domestic tasks and constructing buildings. Many of these colleges and universities have since examined their ties to slavery and have developed plans to address these wrongs. An example is the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, which built a monument to remember the several hundred enslaved people who were used or owned by the university. Enslaved people who had special skills sometimes brought these skills from Africa, including blacksmithing, basket weaving, and the cultivation of rice and indigo. The image on the screen shows a rice pan made from a basket used by enslaved people in North America, similar to those used in West African farms. Enslavers exploited these skills and often advertised them at auctions. Advertisements in newspapers from the period often highlighted these skills to attract higher bids. African Americans also developed new skills through apprenticeship, becoming painters, carpenters, tailors, musicians, and healers. Enslavers could hire out these skilled individuals and keep their income. If they worked on a plantation using a task system, enslaved people could sometimes hire themselves out to accumulate money to buy their freedom or their loved ones' freedom. Musicians among the enslaved people wrote songs and entertained others on the plantation, creating new blends of musical traditions. The second learning objective is to explain how slave labor systems affected the formation of African American musical and linguistic practices. There were differences in the types of work systems on plantations. The first one is the gang system, where enslaved laborers worked in groups from sunup to sundown. Multiple gangs were divided by task difficulty, with men handling the most difficult jobs, like clearing land or cutting sugarcane, while women and weaker men were assigned tasks like removing weeds. Children helped the second group, but often had the shortest work schedules. They were usually under the supervision of an overseer, sometimes a black enslaved person. The gang system cultivated crops like cotton, sugar, and tobacco. While working in these groups, enslaved people created work songs with syncopated rhythms to maintain the pace of their work. They could also sing these songs at a slower pace to collectively work slower as a form of resistance. In the task system, enslaved people worked individually until they met a daily quota, generally with less supervision. If there was supervision, it sometimes came from an overseer who was also a black bondsman. This system was most often used in the cultivation of crops like rice and indigo. While the task system provided more free time, it was a mixed blessing because enslavers expected enslaved people to provide their own food during this free time by growing gardens and small plots near the slave quarters. With less oversight, enslaved people could maintain linguistic practices or learn new ones like Gullah, the Creole language that developed in the Carolina Low Country. They could also gather, sing songs, and share cultural practices. The Gullah culture remains a vibrant testament to the resilience of the African traditions in America, preserving unique linguistic and cultural elements. The last learning objective is to evaluate the economic effects of enslaved people's commodification and labor within and outside of African American communities. The institution of slavery created interdependence between the North and South of the United States. The food crops used to feed Southern slaves often came from middle colonies like New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. Carolina rice plantations were used to feed the enslaved people in the West Indies working on sugar plantations. Later, the finance industry in northern states thrived and benefited from financing the purchase of enslaved people. Banks accepted enslaved people as collateral for loans. The insurance industry also developed policies specifically to protect enslavers' investments in human property, with companies like New York Life Insurance originally selling policies on enslaved people. Scholars also argue that slavery shaped accounting practices by introducing methods of depreciation over time. During the cotton boom, raw materials from the South was used in textile factories in the Northeast. While cities that did not play a major role in the African slave trade, nonetheless benefited from the economy created by slavery. Enslaved people and their labor were foundational to the American economy. Before the Civil War, they accounted for 13% of the U.S. economy, and in the early 19th century, they were responsible for 2/3 of the United States exports. The South, however, was only responsible for 1/10 of the U.S. imports, showing great inequality in the South during this time. Enslaved people built the roads and infrastructure of major cities like New York, Charleston, and Philadelphia. They and their descendants were alienated from the wealth they both embodied and produced because they were barely even fed properly for their work, and any wages they earned were kept by the enslavers when they were hired out. The value of the enslaved workforce in 1860 was estimated to be about $3 billion, more than the combined value of all the railroads and factories in the U.S. Over the centuries, slavery deeply entrenched wealth disparities along racial lines in America. Emancipation came without adequate financial assistance to formerly enslaved people. Conversely, the federal government compensated some enslavers for their loss of property. Once enslaved people were freed, they started out with nothing, despite having generated so much wealth for the country during their enslavement. The Freedmen's Bureau was established in 1865 to aid former enslaved people, but its efforts were often underfunded and met with resistance, limiting its effectiveness. Enslaved people had no wages to pass down to their descendants, creating an intergenerational wealth gap. While they were enslaved, they had no right to accumulate property because the slave codes kept getting stricter after uprisings. Any individual exemption to these laws depended on their enslaver's decision, which was severely limited over time. In some states, manumission was eventually limited, so enslavers could not set their enslaved people free even if they wanted to. Finally, here's the recap. The type of work enslaved people did varied greatly and could depend on gender, age, and locations. Some enslaved people were purchased and utilized by institutions. Enslaved people often possessed valuable skills that were both exploited and used to survive. The gang system and the task system were common work methods used by enslavers. Interdependence was created between the North and the South, with both benefiting from slavery. Enslaved people and their labor were foundational to the American economy, even though they were kept from the fruits of their efforts. Wealth disparity still exists due to the systems utilized to exploit enslaved people. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, click the thumbnail on the screen. And if you would like more resources to help you study, you can visit apushslides.com/afam. I wish you the best of luck with your studies, and I hope to see you back on the next lecture.